A room can laugh at the wrong man for only so long before the truth teaches everyone the meaning of respect. Daniel Carter tightened the sleeve of his well-worn charcoal suit before taking his 8-year-old daughter Lily's hand as they stepped through the towering glass entrance of the Crystal Crown Charity Gala in Manhattan. The brilliant glow of crystal chandeliers spilled across polished marble floors, turning every diamond necklace and tailored tuxedo into shimmering reflections of wealth, while a string quartet filled the ballroom with elegant music that seemed reserved for people born into privilege. Daniel noticed the curious glances almost immediately. His suit was carefully pressed but years old. His shoes had been polished until they almost looked new, though the leather quietly revealed countless mornings of hard work. Lily looked up at her father with complete confidence, smiling as if she believed there was no place in the world where he did not belong. Daniel returned the smile without saying a word. He had learned long ago that dignity never needed permission. Across the ballroom, photographers crowded around Victoria Sinclair, the 37-year-old billionaire CEO whose business empire had transformed entire industries before she reached 40. She greeted investors, philanthropists, and politicians with practiced grace, every conversation measured, every smile effortless. Tonight's gala honored generosity, innovation, and leadership, and everyone expected Victoria to dominate the evening as naturally as she dominated every boardroom she entered. Near the center of the ballroom, one event coordinator hurried toward another with growing concern. A prominent guest had unexpectedly arrived with an additional security team, forcing several seating assignments to change at the last minute. The coordinator scanned the chart before quietly pointing toward Daniel's table. "Put him there," someone whispered with an amused grin. "Seat the single dad beside Victoria. It might make the evening a little more entertaining." A few nearby guests exchanged restrained laughter. None of them imagined those careless words would become the greatest embarrassment of their own lives before the night was over. Daniel followed the attendant to the table without questioning the arrangement. He simply thanked her, pulled out Lily's chair first, and waited until she was comfortably seated before taking his own place. Victoria glanced sideways as he sat beside her. For only a brief second, surprise crossed her face before professionalism returned. She offered a polite nod, though inwardly she assumed the organizers had made an awkward mistake. Around them, whispers quietly drifted between tables. Some wondered whether Daniel had won a charity raffle. Others guessed he was someone's distant relative who did not understand events like this. No one asked him directly. They preferred assumptions over conversation. Daniel remained perfectly calm. He unfolded his napkin, poured Lily a glass of water, and thanked the server with the same sincere kindness he offered everyone else. Lily leaned closer and whispered, "Dad, this place is beautiful." Daniel smiled gently. "The people matter more than the building," he answered softly. "Remember that, sweetheart." Victoria overheard every word. Something about his voice carried neither insecurity nor resentment. It carried quiet certainty. She found herself looking at him once more, this time not because of his inexpensive suit, but because he seemed completely untouched by the silent judgment surrounding him. Somewhere across the ballroom, another wave of laughter rose from a nearby table, but Daniel never looked toward it. He simply adjusted Lily's chair a little closer to the table, folded his hands, and waited patiently as if he belonged there just as much as anyone wearing a custom-made tuxedo or a seven-figure evening gown. No one in that magnificent ballroom realized they were only minutes away from discovering that the least impressive-looking man in the room possessed a legacy greater than the fortunes surrounding him. Daniel Carter had long ago stopped measuring people by the size of their homes, the labels inside their jackets, or the number of cameras following them. Every morning began exactly the same way, long before the sun climbed above the rooftops of his quiet neighborhood outside Manhattan. At 5:30, the alarm sounded softly beside his bed, and within minutes he was already preparing breakfast while the coffee slowly filled the modest kitchen with its familiar warmth. Pancakes on Saturdays, oatmeal during busy weekdays, scrambled eggs whenever Lily had an important spelling test because she always insisted they were a lucky breakfast. The apartment was small, but every corner reflected care rather than compromise. Family photographs covered one wall instead of expensive artwork. Lily's colorful school projects decorated the refrigerator. A tiny bookshelf overflowed with borrowed library books because Daniel believed imagination should never depend on money. Before Lily woke each morning, Daniel carefully ironed his work clothes, packed her lunch, checked her homework one final time, and made certain there was always a handwritten note tucked inside her lunchbox. Sometimes the notes were simple reminders to smile. Sometimes they were short Bible verses his own father had once shared with him. Most often they simply read, "I believe in you." Lily kept every single one inside a small memory box beneath her bed. Their mornings never felt rushed despite the responsibilities they carried together. Daniel believed children remembered feelings much longer than schedules. On the drive to school, they played guessing games about the clouds, laughed over old songs on the radio, or talked about the people they hoped to help that day. Whenever Lily asked why they always thanked the crossing guard, the grocery clerk, or the mail carrier by name, Daniel answered the same way. Respect costs nothing, sweetheart, but it can become the richest gift someone receives all day. After dropping Lily off at school, Daniel spent long hours repairing communications equipment for hospitals, schools, and nonprofit organizations. The work demanded patience more than recognition. Most clients never knew how many late evenings he invested making certain every system worked perfectly before anyone arrived the next morning. He rarely advertised his business and almost never accepted projects that would prevent him from attending Lily's school concerts, parent meetings, or soccer games. Some friends had encouraged him to pursue larger contracts that promised enormous profits. But Daniel quietly declined each opportunity that required sacrificing the promises he had made to his daughter after losing his wife years earlier. His priorities never changed with the seasons. In the evenings, father and daughter often walked through their neighborhood, carrying small bags of dog treats for pets they met along the sidewalks. Daniel remembered the names of elderly neighbors, shoveled snow from shared driveways without being asked, and fixed broken porch lights whenever someone needed an extra hand. He never announced these small acts of kindness because he believed generosity became less valuable when it demanded applause. Sitting beneath the brilliant chandeliers of the Gala now, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, Daniel felt no desire to become someone else. He had already built the life he considered successful, measured not by bank accounts or headlines, but by the quiet confidence in Lily's smile each time she reached for his hand, completely certain that the greatest man she had ever known was sitting right beside her. Victoria Sinclair had built a reputation that newspapers admired and competitors feared long before she became one of the youngest billionaire chief executive officers in America. Every weekday began before sunrise inside a penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, where floor-to-ceiling windows welcomed the first light across polished stone floors and carefully selected artwork collected from around the world. Her schedule was organized almost to the minute. International conference calls began before breakfast. Executive briefings filled the morning. Board meetings occupied the afternoon. Charity events, investor dinners, and public appearances completed evenings that rarely belonged to her alone. Success had become both her greatest achievement and the quiet wall separating her from ordinary life. People greeted her with admiration wherever she went, yet very few ever spoke to her without first calculating what they hoped to gain. She had grown accustomed to expensive compliments, polished conversations, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Somewhere along the journey from ambitious entrepreneur to celebrated business icon, she had unconsciously started believing that accomplishment could usually be recognized by appearance. Confidence seemed to wear tailored suits. Leadership appeared to arrive in luxury vehicles. Influence often introduced itself before the person ever entered the room. She never intended to become judgmental. It simply happened one successful year at a time. Her charitable foundation donated millions of dollars every year to hospitals, education, and community programs, earning praise from both the media and civic leaders. Yet even generosity had become another carefully managed responsibility. Every donation passed through committees. Every project required reports, presentations, and measurable results. Without realizing it, Victoria had begun trusting impressive resumes more than quiet character. Sitting beside Daniel Carter at the Gala challenged that habit in a way she did not immediately understand. She noticed the age of his suit before she noticed the calm confidence in his posture. She observed his polished but worn shoes before recognizing the kindness in his voice whenever he spoke to Lily or thanked a member of the serving staff. She assumed simplicity reflected limitation because that had become the language of the world surrounding her. Across the ballroom, conversations continued beneath sparkling chandeliers, while influential guests greeted one another with polished introductions and carefully exchanged business cards. Victoria answered questions, smiled for photographs, and acknowledged familiar faces, but her attention drifted back toward the quiet father seated beside her more often than she expected. Daniel never attempted to impress anyone. He never searched the room for famous faces. He never inserted himself into conversations with powerful executives. Instead, he listened patiently whenever Lily spoke, encouraged her to taste unfamiliar food with a reassuring smile, and thanked every waiter by name after reading each name tag. It was a level of quiet attentiveness that seemed strangely unfamiliar inside a room filled with extraordinary accomplishments. Victoria found herself wondering why someone so comfortable with being overlooked appeared more peaceful than many of the wealthiest people surrounding them. Before she could answer that question, the atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted almost imperceptibly. Near the entrance, several distinguished guests had just arrived, and instead of walking toward the evening's most celebrated executives, their eyes searched the room until they settled upon one unexpected table, leaving Victoria with the uneasy feeling that the story unfolding around Daniel Carter had only just begun. The first distinguished guest to cross the ballroom was a retired four-star general whose name frequently appeared on national television whenever leadership was discussed. Conversations paused as people watched him walk confidently past senators, celebrated philanthropists, and several Fortune 500 executives without slowing his pace. To the surprise of everyone nearby, he stopped directly beside Daniel Carter. A broad smile replaced his formal expression as he extended both hands. "Daniel, it has been far too long," he said warmly. "I have wanted to thank you in person again." Daniel stood respectfully and returned the handshake with genuine humility. "General Harrison, it is wonderful to see you again. How is your family?" The older man smiled even wider. "Much better because of people like you." Before Daniel could answer, another guest approached. This time, it was Dr. Emily Foster, one of the country's most respected medical researchers. She greeted Daniel with the familiarity of an old friend instead of the cautious politeness usually reserved for strangers at formal events. "I cannot believe we finally meet again outside a conference room," she laughed softly. "I still tell young engineers about your advice every year." Daniel lowered his eyes with an almost embarrassed smile. "You always gave the credit to the entire team." Dr. Foster shook her head gently. "Because you always insisted that no achievement belongs to one person." Victoria watched the exchange in complete silence. The room around her slowly began changing. Guests who had ignored Daniel only minutes earlier now leaned forward in their chairs, whispering to one another as more respected figures quietly gathered around his table. A well-known technology entrepreneur arrived next, followed by the president of a large nonprofit organization, then a hospital administrator who warmly embraced Daniel as though greeting a lifelong friend. None of them appeared interested in speaking with the evening's celebrity donors first. They had all come to see the quiet single father wearing the modest charcoal suit. Victoria found herself searching her memory. She knew nearly every influential person in attendance, yet she could not understand why so many remarkable individuals clearly admired a man whose name had never appeared on the covers of business magazines. She studied Daniel carefully as each conversation unfolded. He accepted every compliment with the same humble response. He redirected praise toward other people. He asked sincere questions about families instead of careers. He remembered children's names, birthdays, and personal details that powerful executives often forgot. Nothing about his behavior suggested someone trying to impress the room. Instead, it seemed the room had quietly begun trying to honor him. Lily noticed the growing crowd and looked up at her father with innocent curiosity. "Dad, do you know everybody?" she whispered with a smile. Daniel chuckled softly and gently squeezed her hand beneath the table. "Not everybody, sweetheart. Just a few kind people I have been fortunate enough to meet." Victoria heard his answer and felt unexpectedly unsettled. Most successful people she knew collected relationships like business assets. Daniel treated every acquaintance as though titles and achievements disappeared the moment genuine conversation began. Across the ballroom, the earlier laughter had completely vanished. The guests who had quietly mocked the seating arrangement now exchanged uncertain glances, realizing they had misjudged someone important without even introducing themselves. Victoria lowered her eyes for a brief moment, wondering whether her own first impression had revealed more about herself than it ever had about the quiet man sitting beside her. While somewhere near the stage, the master of ceremonies prepared to announce the next event that would change the entire evening forever. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage with an easy smile and welcomed everyone to the evening's feature presentations, inviting guests to enjoy dinner before the foundation announced several new humanitarian initiatives. Crystal glasses softly touched one another as conversations resumed, and the orchestra shifted into a gentle melody that settled across the ballroom like a calm breeze. Daniel leaned toward Lily and quietly asked if she was enjoying the evening. She nodded enthusiastically before whispering that the chocolate dessert looked almost too beautiful to eat. Daniel laughed softly. "Then we should admire it for another minute before deciding," he replied. Victoria overheard the exchange again and found herself smiling without realizing it. At that exact moment, a gentle murmur spread through the ballroom. An elderly philanthropist named Robert Langford, one of the foundation's oldest supporters, suddenly appeared unsteady while speaking with several guests near the front of the room. His expression became pale, and he slowly reached for the back of a chair as those around him exchanged confused looks. Several people instinctively stepped backward, unsure how to respond. A server hurried toward the nearest event coordinator while someone quietly suggested calling the hotel's medical staff. Daniel had already risen from his chair before anyone finished speaking. Without rushing or creating alarm, he walked calmly toward Mr. Langford with the reassuring confidence of someone completely focused on helping another person rather than attracting attention. He spoke in a gentle voice that immediately eased the tension. "Sir, please remain seated if you are comfortable. Take slow breaths. Help is already on the way." Mr. Langford looked up and managed a grateful nod. Daniel pulled a nearby chair into a safer position, offered him a glass of water only after confirming it was appropriate, and asked several calm questions that helped keep the gentleman relaxed while hotel medical personnel arrived within moments. His words were steady, respectful, and reassuring. There was no panic in his voice, only quiet confidence. Lily watched her father with familiar admiration because she had seen that same calm presence whenever neighbors needed help or classmates felt afraid. Victoria remained standing beside her table, unable to take her eyes off Daniel. She noticed how naturally people began following his simple instructions without argument. Hotel staff coordinated smoothly around him. Guests lowered their voices. The confusion dissolved into quiet cooperation. When a medical team reached Mr. Langford, Daniel stepped back immediately, thanked them for arriving so quickly, and returned every bit of responsibility to the professionals. He neither interrupted nor attempted to remain the center of attention. Before returning to his seat, he simply wished the older gentleman well. Mr. Langford reached out and briefly squeezed Daniel's hand with visible gratitude. "Thank you, my friend," he said warmly. "You always seem to appear exactly when people need you." Daniel smiled gently. "I'm grateful you are feeling better." As he walked back toward Lily, scattered applause quietly began somewhere near the rear of the ballroom. Within seconds, more guests joined in, not because anyone had requested recognition, but because they had witnessed genuine character expressed through calm action. Daniel looked almost uncomfortable with the attention and gave a small nod before sitting beside his daughter once again. Victoria studied him in thoughtful silence. For the first time that evening, she realized she no longer wondered why remarkable people respected Daniel Carter. Instead, she found herself asking a far more difficult question. What kind of life had shaped a man who instinctively placed another person's well-being ahead of his own reputation? And why did it suddenly feel as though the greatest story of the night had not even been told yet? The applause gradually faded into respectful silence as the master of ceremonies returned to the stage, his expression carrying an unusual mixture of excitement and gratitude. He glanced toward Daniel Carter before looking back at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we continue with tonight's program, our foundation has one additional recognition that was never included in the printed schedule." Curious whispers spread across the ballroom. Victoria quietly folded her hands, her attention fixed on the stage. Daniel simply continued helping Lily cut a small piece of chocolate cake, unaware that every eye in the room was about to turn toward him. The presenter smiled warmly. Several years ago, when hospitals, emergency responders, and nonprofit organizations across the country struggled with outdated communication systems, one engineer quietly developed a secure emergency coordination platform that dramatically improved response times during natural disasters and public emergencies. Instead of selling that technology for extraordinary personal profit, he donated the core design so communities with limited resources could benefit from it without financial barriers. The ballroom became noticeably quieter. The presenter paused before continuing. "Millions of Americans have benefited from that decision without ever learning the name of the man responsible. Tonight, we have the privilege of thanking him publicly for the first time." Daniel slowly lifted his eyes from Lily's plate. His expression remained calm, almost puzzled. Victoria looked from the stage back to Daniel, her heartbeat quickening as realization slowly replaced uncertainty. The presenter extended one hand toward Daniel's table. "Please join me in recognizing Mr. Daniel Carter." For several seconds, no one moved. It was as though the entire ballroom needed time to understand what they had just heard. Then General Harrison rose to his feet first. Dr. Emily Foster immediately followed. Robert Langford stood beside them despite the encouragement to remain seated. Within moments, every guest in the ballroom was standing. The applause returned, louder than before, yet somehow more respectful. It was no longer applause for wealth, influence, or public success. It was gratitude offered to a man who had quietly changed countless lives without asking anyone to remember his name. Daniel remained seated for one brief moment, looking almost uncomfortable with the attention. Lily reached for his hand beneath the table and smiled with quiet pride. "They're clapping for you, Dad," she whispered softly. Daniel looked at her before gently shaking his head with a humble smile. "They are clapping for what people accomplish together," he answered. Even now, he refused to place himself above anyone else. Victoria felt an unexpected heaviness settle inside her heart. Every assumption she had made earlier that evening now seemed painfully shallow. She remembered noticing his worn suit before his character, his simple appearance before his quiet confidence, his ordinary entrance before his extraordinary life. She realized that the richest person at her table had never been measured by the balance inside a bank account. It had been measured by generosity that expected nothing in return. As Daniel finally stood, the applause continued. He walked toward the stage with the same steady humility he had shown since entering the ballroom, offering grateful nods instead of triumphant gestures. There was no pride in his expression, only quiet appreciation. The magnificent chandeliers reflected across hundreds of tearful eyes as an entire room silently confronted its own first impressions. In that unforgettable moment, the expensive jewelry, designer gowns, custom tuxedos, and celebrated reputations no longer defined greatness. Quiet dignity did. And for Victoria Sinclair, the lesson she would remember for the rest of her life had only just begun. Daniel accepted the recognition with the same quiet grace that had guided every decision of his life. Standing beneath the brilliant chandeliers, he thanked the foundation, acknowledged the engineers, emergency responders, nonprofit organizations, and volunteers who had improved the system over the years, then ended his remarks with a single sentence that lingered in the silence after the applause faded. The greatest success is not being remembered. It is knowing someone else is safer because you chose to help. He stepped away from the microphone before anyone expected him to. Continue and returned directly to Lily, who wrapped both arms around his waist with unmistakable pride. Daniel smiled, kissed the top of her head, and quietly asked if she had finished her dessert. She laughed and nodded, as though the standing ovation had been the least important part of her evening. Victoria remained seated for only another moment before taking a slow breath. Every instinct told her to stay where she was until the program resumed, yet something stronger urged her forward. She rose from her chair and crossed the ballroom while conversations gradually softened around her. Guests noticed where she was going and instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path toward Daniel's table. When she finally stopped beside him, Daniel stood politely, believing she wished to congratulate him. Instead, Victoria looked directly into his eyes, her confident expression replaced by genuine humility. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "before I say anything else, I owe you an apology." Daniel looked at her with calm curiosity, but said nothing. Victoria continued without looking away. "When you first sat beside me tonight, I judged you before learning a single thing about you. I noticed your suit before your character. I assumed your circumstances reflected your worth. I was completely wrong." The ballroom became remarkably quiet once again. Nearby conversations disappeared as people realized what was happening. Victoria took another steady breath. "I have spent years encouraging others to look beyond appearances, yet tonight I failed to follow my own advice. I am truly sorry." Daniel remained silent for a brief moment, not because he wished to make the moment uncomfortable, but because he believed sincere words deserved sincere attention. Then a gentle smile appeared across his face. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "We all make first impressions. The important part is what we choose to do after we realize they were incomplete." Victoria felt unexpected relief wash across her expression. She had prepared herself for polite acceptance, perhaps even understandable distance, but instead she received compassion without hesitation. Daniel held no bitterness in his voice. There was no desire to embarrass her in return, no quiet satisfaction in watching someone powerful admit a mistake. He simply offered the same grace he had extended to strangers throughout his entire life. Lily looked up at Victoria with innocent curiosity before smiling warmly. "My dad always says people can change their minds when they learn something new." Victoria smiled through eyes that had become noticeably brighter. "Your father is a very wise man," she answered gently. Around them, several guests lowered their heads, reflecting on their own assumptions from earlier that evening. The laughter that had once surrounded Daniel's arrival now felt distant and insignificant. Respect had quietly replaced judgment, and humility had accomplished what pride never could. As the orchestra softly resumed playing in the background, Victoria realized that the greatest gift Daniel Carter had offered the ballroom was not the remarkable technology that had saved countless lives. It was the living example that true greatness never needed to announce itself, because genuine character always revealed itself at exactly the right moment. The formal program slowly gave way to quiet conversations as guests drifted toward the ballroom's floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. Beyond the glass, thousands of lights stretched across the city like tiny stars resting on the earth, reminding everyone that even the busiest lives eventually became quiet when viewed from a distance. Daniel stood with Lily near the balcony entrance, helping her identify famous buildings while she excitedly pointed toward the glowing Empire State Building in the distance. Victoria watched them for a moment before gathering the courage to walk over once again, this time without photographers, executives, or expectations surrounding her. "Would you mind if I joined you?" she asked with a gentle smile. Daniel nodded warmly. "Of course not." Lily smiled and stepped closer to the window, leaving the two adults standing beside one another in comfortable silence. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The city seemed to provide the conversation they both needed. Finally, Victoria exhaled softly. I spend so much time looking at this skyline from my office, she admitted, but tonight feels different. I have never realized how easy it is to build successful companies while quietly neglecting the lessons that actually matter. Daniel rested one hand inside his jacket pocket and looked across the lights. Life has a way of teaching those lessons when we are ready to receive them. Victoria gave a thoughtful smile. Did you ever regret donating your technology instead of building a fortune from it? Daniel answered almost immediately. No. She looked surprised by the certainty in his voice. He continued calmly. Money solves many problems. I respect that. But I never wanted to wonder whether someone lost an opportunity to receive help because they could not afford it. I sleep peacefully knowing I made the decision I could explain to my daughter without hesitation. Victoria looked toward Lily, who continued admiring the skyline with innocent wonder. She is fortunate to have you. Daniel smiled. I believe I am the fortunate one. The simplicity of his answer lingered between them. It contained no performance, no carefully prepared wisdom, only quiet truth. Victoria lowered her eyes for a brief moment before speaking again. I have attended hundreds of charity events, but tonight is the first time I truly understand the difference between generosity and reputation. Daniel turned toward her with genuine curiosity. What do you mean? She smiled gently. Generosity continues helping people even when nobody knows who deserves the credit. Reputation often hopes someone is watching. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. That is a lesson many of us spend years learning. They both laughed softly, not at each other, but at the shared recognition that growth rarely arrived through comfort. Lily suddenly turned around holding 2 untouched cups of hot chocolate she had found on a nearby refreshment table with permission from a server. I brought one for each of you, she announced proudly. Daniel accepted his cup with gratitude, while Victoria did the same, touched by the little girl's simple kindness. They stood together, overlooking the city, warming their hands around the steaming cups as a cool autumn breeze drifted across the balcony. No one spoke for several peaceful moments. There was nothing left to prove. No titles mattered beneath the night sky. No balance sheets could measure the quiet respect growing between them. When the orchestra inside the ballroom began playing the final song of the evening, Victoria realized that she had arrived expecting to celebrate achievement, yet she was leaving with something infinitely more valuable. She had found a reminder that the strongest people rarely raise their voices, the kindest hearts seldom introduce themselves, and the greatest examples of leadership often entered a room wearing the simplest suit of all. 1 year passed more quickly than anyone expected, and on a crisp autumn evening the Crystal Crown Charity Gala once again welcomed community leaders, entrepreneurs, researchers, volunteers, and families into the same magnificent ballroom where countless assumptions had quietly been transformed into lasting respect. The chandeliers sparkled just as brilliantly as they had the year before. The orchestra filled the room with elegant music, and polished marble floors reflected the warm golden light across every smiling face. Yet something important had changed long before the first guest arrived. When the event coordinator reviewed the seating chart that afternoon, Victoria Sinclair made only one personal request. She declined invitations to sit beside governors, celebrities, and influential investors. Instead, she smiled and pointed toward one empty chair. Please save that seat for Daniel Carter. The coordinator nodded without surprise because everyone involved with the foundation already understood why. Shortly after sunset, Daniel entered the ballroom holding Lily's hand exactly as he had 1 year earlier. His charcoal suit was the same carefully pressed suit he had worn before. His shoes remained polished, but comfortably familiar. Nothing about his appearance suggested he had become someone different. That was because he had never believed respect required changing who he already was. Lily looked around the ballroom with excited eyes, before quietly whispering, "Dad, I think more people know your name this year." Daniel smiled warmly. "Then we should make sure we remember theirs too." Before they reached their table, several guests greeted them with genuine affection. Hotel staff welcomed them like old friends. Volunteers thanked Daniel for inspiring new scholarship programs. Engineers introduced their children to the quiet man, whose example had encouraged them to pursue careers dedicated to serving others. Daniel accepted every conversation with the same humility he had shown throughout his life, never rushing, never pretending to be more important than anyone standing before him. Across the ballroom, Victoria saw Daniel arrive and immediately walked toward him with a bright, sincere smile. There were no cameras following her and no reporters waiting nearby. She simply extended her hand before gently placing the other over her heart. "Welcome back," she said warmly. "Your seat has been waiting for you." Daniel smiled. "Thank you, Victoria." Lily laughed softly. "I knew you would save it." Victoria looked at the little girl with genuine affection. Some seats are reserved because of wealth. Others are reserved because they have been earned. As they reached the table together, conversations naturally slowed. Many guests remember the previous year's unexpected lesson, but no one laughed this time. Instead, people quietly stood as Daniel and Lily took their seats. No announcement had been planned. No one instructed them to rise. Respect simply moved through the room one person at a time until every guest was standing. Daniel looked around with quiet gratitude before gently shaking his head, almost embarrassed by the attention. Victoria noticed the familiar expression and smiled because she understood it now. Real dignity never demanded recognition. It accepted kindness with humility and continued serving others exactly the same way afterward. The orchestra began playing once more as everyone returned to their seats, but the most powerful moment of the evening had already passed without a single dramatic speech. It lived instead in the silence shared by hundreds of people who finally understood that greatness is rarely announced by appearance, wealth, or applause. It is revealed through quiet character, steady compassion, and the courage to treat every person with respect before knowing their story. And as Daniel reached for Lily's hand while Victoria smiled beside them, the ballroom became a place where second chances had quietly become lasting friendships, where judgment had given way to grace, and where the simplest man in the room had forever changed the hearts of everyone who had once failed to see him.